It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
And welcome back to another episode of the Real Estate Breakfast, talking property news. We do that 7 days a week, as heard on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts and Amazon, as we work towards another weekend around Australia. Yes, another Friday is here, August the 2nd. And good luck if you are transacting on any property coming up this weekend. Let's right now go to Sydney and catch up with a person that has been away on holiday to Europe, and that is Margaret Lomas from Destiny Financial Solutions. And good morning to you, Margaret. Welcome back to the Real Estate Breakfast. How was your trip? Lucky you.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I want to point out is that because I'm the eternal budgeter, then I'm also very good with using frequent flyer points. So I can go away often using those frequent flyer points and all of my flights are covered. So at least that makes, going away a lot better in terms of the cost to you. And I'm also a really good hotel hunter and bargain hunter. And, my whole life is all about that sort of thing. So I was able to go away. I went to Italy and Switzerland, Portugal and Spain. And although it is very expensive to be overseas at the moment, I think I always get good value for the things that I'm doing when I'm away.
Okay, so come on, what's a couple of highlights on this big trip to Europe? You must have a couple.
I do have a couple. I think the Bernina Express through the Swiss Alps is really fabulous and something that everybody needs to do at some point. Very breathtaking trip. So we really enjoyed that. We love Italy. We've been to Italy quite a few times now and really love that. So we did a different part of Italy. We did the northwest coast, which is very pretty, and some lovely little towns along there. So we really enjoyed that. I'm going to tell you one of my highlights, and it's going to be really left field, something very different.
Great.
When we're in Amsterdam, because we didn't plan well enough ahead and book our tickets 3 months ahead to go into the Anne Frank house, we ended up with a morning free, and we found a little place called Body Works or Body World. And it's 5 floors. It's a museum, which is 5 floors of actual body parts and bodies that have been donated to science. And you go through these 5 floors and have a look at they have full bodies all in different poses, and you can see all the nerves and all the muscles and all the bones and all the different things in these bodies. And they have all the livers, and they have the smokers' livers and the smokers' lungs, and they have the alcoholic livers. And it's just a fascinating place. So interestingly enough, that was my highlight.
Yeah, I suppose if you're looking at lungs of smokers, and if you were a smoker, that could be one way to give up potentially.
Oh, yeah. These lungs were terrible. So definitely, if you are a smoker, I suggest you try to have a look at those smokers' lungs. It'll change your mind immediately.
Now, I want to talk about, first off, rental yields. Now, we were talking about this last week, and I thought, let's get your opinion on this. Domain reported that when you compare the average rate for an investor loan to the gross rental yields, many will find their costs are still exceeding their income. And they highlight in Sydney the gross rental yields have declined by 0.8% year on year. Brisbane is down 6.3%. And Melbourne is up, however, 9.7%. So it's kind of shifting around a little bit on those gross rental yields.
Let's remember that gross rental yield is based on the yield that you can achieve for the price that you've paid for the property. So the reason we're seeing Brisbane and Sydney declining in their gross rental yields is because of the property price growth. Rents haven't grown as fast as property prices have, despite the fact that we do know that rents in those 2 capital cities have definitely increased. They've increased off a fairly low base, particularly in Sydney, because previously you wouldn't be able to get a rental yield of much above 2%, and now you can get a rental yield higher than that in some areas, and that's thanks to the recent growth in rental rates. So relative rents have grown, but rents relative to purchase price, that's why we're seeing that fall. And because Melbourne property prices haven't had quite the boom that property in other states has had, this is why Melbourne is now showing that their rents are growing, but their property prices aren't growing quite as quickly. I guess the whole question is around what do investors do if they're considering the fact that their properties are now not really returning enough to cover their costs. Well, welcome to the old days, and this is how it always was when we invested in property. I think I built the bulk of my portfolio during a time when standard interest rates were 8 or 9%. Rental yields, if you could get them at 5 in an area that might have had good rental yields. And you always had that gap that you had to fill in from your own pocket. The marketers used to always market properties saying, you can invest in this from as little as $50 or $60 or $70 a week. And that meant that that's the shortfall. That's the amount of money that you had to pay. There's a couple of things that investors can do, and they have to think about these as well. If you do an upgrade to your property, the capital cost might be X amount, but then you get depreciation benefits from that, which will increase your on-paper costs, get more tax back for you, and help to fill that gap just a little bit. So often people they might have a loan on a property, they might increase that loan by a little bit to carry out some renovations, and then because they are the first owner of that plant and equipment used in that renovation, they can get a bigger tax deduction.
Also, I guess, when you can't sort of make the dollars and cents work with some of the properties inside the portfolio, last week, that very question, I asked Jeremy, a property investor in Brisbane, if he knew of other investors who were selling off any of their stock. And this is what he said.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've got a friend of mine who went nuts during the property market boom and leveraged against the other. And he ended up with more than 20 properties. A lot of them were in sort of outback towns, smaller prices, which have obviously been feeling the pinch a lot more than the CBDs. So he's having to let some go. And other people are feeling the pinch. I think the report said the other day there's over a million Australian households who are in mortgage stress. So they may be late on one payment. They may have skipped one payment because of the cost of the mortgages have gone up, and they're having to reevaluate. Do we sell, or do we actually cut back our lifestyle? Do we sell the extra car so we can actually pay the mortgage for this month? People out there are feeling the stress. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Margaret, I found that really interesting for a couple of points. Obviously, selling off some of the stock, but I don't think it can be underscored too much that people, since COVID, some people have really sort of rocket turbo fueled up their portfolio. Some people didn't even have a portfolio, and that case there alone, his friend, 20 properties since COVID.
There's 3 shows out of that soundbite. I could discuss that particular soundbite forever and draw some really important lessons for property investors out of what he's saying. A friend who bought things mainly in outback towns. Well, my first question would be, why did he only buy in outback towns? That's not diversification to me. And if he did buy in outback towns, did he ask the important questions about those towns to establish that they would have a future that would be conducive to being a property investor? So it's fine to just say, well, I'm going to buy out in Whoop Whoop or wherever because I can buy a property for $150,000 and it'll rent for $500 a week. That's fine. But if that property never ever grows and doesn't have the growth drivers in the area to make that property grow in value, it's not a good investment. And at some point in time, you'll probably struggle with that mortgage if interest rates go up. So people dived in using, to me, the wrong basis on which to invest. There's some basic fundamental property investing lessons that people need to understand, apply, regardless of whether the market is booming or falling. And those fundamentals will mean that you can buy a property and not have to suddenly get stressed out and have to sell off. This fellow who bought the 20 over-leveraged, obviously, on properties that were never going to be able to grow in the first place, or probably not be able to grow well, and then finds himself having to sell them off because he can't afford to keep them. He didn't think long term. He didn't ask one of the most basic questions, which is, can I afford to keep this portfolio if interest rates go up 3%, 4% and 5%? That's one of the most important things investors need to do. To say, is it because of the situation that people are having to sell off their portfolio? My answer to that is no, it's not because of the economic situation. It's because they didn't do the basic due diligence and groundwork, and they didn't inspect their own financial circumstances well enough in the first place to establish whether they could continue to hold that portfolio through the tough times as well as through the good times.
Which kind of brings up a very good question, and that is stress testing yourself as an investor, which is what you're saying. Of course, the banks will stress test you. You may look very good on paper, hence the reason why in this particular case, he has been able to leverage himself into 20 properties. But this stress testing yourself, I mean, as a prolific investor over the years, this is something that you have done. You've said, yes, okay, the bank is giving me the money. I need to just drill down here and go further into my own set of accounts to make sure that if A, B, and C happen, I've got enough money to cover myself.
Exactly. And the kind of stress testing that the bank does is that they have a look at your income, they have a look at your expenses, and these days they actually get your actual expenses off you rather than trust a matrix where they used to say, well, you're two adults and 2 kids, this is how much you spend per year. That they don't do that any longer. They want your actual expenses. And then what they do is they build in 3% into the interest rate to see if you could handle that interest rate rise during the term of the loan, given your current expenses. What they don't do is they don't take into account inflation and what would happen if we also have a cost of living crisis at the same time that you're buying and investing in property. So for you, it's all very well for you to say, well, can I invest and stand a 3% interest rate hike? But you also need to say at the same time, because if interest rates are going up, it is going up to curb inflation. So at the same time, your cost of living is also going to go up. Otherwise, the interest rates wouldn't be going up. So you also need to then build in that margin for your personal everyday expenses. And I think that's where a lot of investors go wrong. They don't dive deeply enough into their own personal financial circumstances. Things like if you've got a child who's, say, 2 years of age, then at some point during the period of your loan, you might have schooling costs. You might be choosing to send that child to a private school. Things will change and that will be an additional cost. You need to sit down and look at your budget. One of the things that we always have done with our clients is sat down and looked at all of their income and expenses and then gone back to them and said, okay, that's fine. This is what you earn and spend now, but what's the future going to look like? And if there are changes, can you afford to maintain this mortgage and any future mortgages into the long term? I think that's where many investors go wrong because they get so caught up and excited about investing in property. They see cheap property and go, wow, I can become a property owner and the bank is going to give me the money. Let's go for it. But they don't think about the big picture.
All right, so some great advice coming from Margaret this morning, freshly back from Europe, and great comments that you've made. Enjoy your Friday, enjoy the weekend coming up, Margaret, and thanks for coming back on to the Real Estate Breakfast.
Thank you.
We help to break down real estate every day to help you better understand the Australian property market.
Well, Craig, I think mortgage holders would breathe a sigh of relief after the inflation numbers that were published yesterday. And the reason being is that this inflation report was largely seen as a bit of a make or break report. There was some in the market that thought if it's an ugly number, the RBA may be forced to hike rates again. I think they would be a very reluctant hiker and the threshold for another rate hike is high.
So there's really no reason then for the RBA to look at hiking this up next Tuesday from your point of view?
Look, I think they'll certainly discuss a rate hike. The last time they met for a board meeting, they discussed whether to leave rates on hold or whether to hike rates. Given that the underlying inflation rate is a tad above their own forecast, I think that a rate hike will still be discussed.
We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.